Rick Hawthorne was not your average tourist. He was a man who liked things done his way, and he didn't hesitate to let others know it. With a thick wallet and an even thicker sense of entitlement, Rick had made a name for himself back in Florida as a successful real estate developer. But success had gone to his head over the years, and now, at 47, he carried himself with an air of superiority that rubbed many people the wrong way. This summer, Rick decided to take his family on a grand European vacation. They flew first class, stayed in 5-star hotels, and dined at the fanciest restaurants. For Rick, this trip wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about showing off. Every moment of their journey was documented on social media, complete with captions boasting about how amazing their lives were. And when they landed in London, Rick couldn't wait to visit one of the city's most iconic landmarks, Buckingham Palace. On the day of their visit, the weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, and the streets buzzed with excitement. Tourists from all over the world gathered outside the palace gates, eager to catch a glimpse of its grandeur. Rick walked ahead of his wife and 2 teenage kids, holding his phone high to capture every angle. The golden gates, the statuesque architecture, the red uniforms of the royal guards. It was everything he'd imagined and more. But something quickly began to irritate him. The royal guards, standing tall and motionless, refused to acknowledge the crowd. No smiles, no waves, no interaction whatsoever. Rick frowned as he approached one of them, hoping to get a reaction. "Hey, buddy," he said loudly, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. "You gonna move or what? We're trying to enjoy our vacation here." The guard didn't flinch, not even a blink. This baffled Rick. Back home, people always paid attention to him. He was used to being noticed, respected. But here, these guards acted like statues, completely indifferent to his presence. It felt like a personal insult. Rick turned to his family, shaking his head. "Can you believe this? These guys are supposed to represent royalty, and they won't even look at us. What's the point of coming all the way here if they don't care?" His wife, Laura, sighed. She knew better than to argue with Rick when he got like this. Their kids rolled their eyes, used to their father's outbursts. But Rick wasn't done yet. As he scanned the line of guards, one particular figure caught his eye. A black officer standing perfectly still, his uniform pristine and polished. Something about the man's calm demeanor infuriated Rick even more. "Look at this guy," Rick muttered under his breath, pointing at the guard. "Standing there like he owns the place. Bet he doesn't even belong here." His words dripped with disdain, though no one around him seemed to notice. Laura tugged at his arm, urging him to keep moving, but Rick planted his feet firmly on the ground. His frustration was growing, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. What Rick didn't realize was that his actions were already drawing attention. Nearby tourists exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Little did Rick know, his next move would change everything, for the worse. Months turned into years, and Rick's life began to take on a new shape, one defined not by wealth or privilege, but by humility and purpose. Though the scars of his past remained, he had learned to carry them as reminders of how far he'd come. The man who once strutted through life demanding attention now walked quietly, speaking only when necessary and listening far more than he ever had before. It was a transformation that surprised even him. Rick continued attending anti-racism workshops, not because he was required to, but because he found solace in the process. Each session deepened his understanding of systemic inequality and the subtle ways bias could manifest in everyday interactions. He also discovered a passion for mentoring others, particularly young people struggling with anger or entitlement. Drawing from his own experiences, he shared stories of his mistakes and the lessons they taught him. "You're going to mess up," he often said. "We all do. But it's what you do after that counts." His public speaking engagements became less about apologizing for his past and more about inspiring change. Audiences grew warmer over time, their initial skepticism giving way to appreciation for his honesty and vulnerability. Teachers invited him back to schools where students greeted him like an old friend, eager to ask questions or share their thoughts. One boy, barely 12 years old, approached him after a talk and handed him a drawing. It depicted two figures shaking hands beneath a rainbow, a symbol of peace and reconciliation. Rick kept the picture taped to his fridge, a small but powerful reminder of the impact he could still have. Despite these strides, forgiveness remained elusive. Daniel Okoye, though supportive of Rick's efforts, never fully opened up to him. Their relationship stayed professional, built on mutual respect rather than friendship. Still, Rick didn't resent this distance. He understood that healing took time. And for some wounds, closure might never come. What mattered most was that Daniel acknowledged Rick's progress, even if trust between them remained fragile. Back home, Rick's family dynamics showed signs of repair, albeit slowly. His children, now young adults, occasionally reached out to check on him, their conversations cautious but sincere. Laura, too, softened slightly, agreeing to meet for coffee every few months. They spoke mostly about their kids, avoiding heavier topics like divorce or regret. Yet these small gestures meant the world to Rick, proof that broken relationships could mend, even if imperfectly. Professionally, Rick rebuilt his life in modest ways. He took a job at a local nonprofit focused on education and community development, trading boardroom meetings for grassroots initiatives. While the pay was minimal compared to his former salary, the work filled him with a sense of fulfillment he'd never known in real estate. Colleagues admired his dedication, unaware of the turmoil he'd endured to reach this point. One day, while volunteering at a community center, Rick received an unexpected invitation. Corporal Daniel Okoye had been awarded a prestigious honor for his service and advocacy work, and he wanted Rick to attend the ceremony. Shocked but honored, Rick accepted, unsure of what to expect. On the day of the event, he dressed simply, hoping to blend into the crowd. But when Daniel stepped onto the stage to accept his award, he paused mid-speech and gestured toward Rick. "This journey hasn't been easy for either of us," Daniel said, his voice steady yet kind. "But I believe in second chances, and I believe that true growth comes from accountability." The room erupted in applause, leaving Rick speechless. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope, not just for redemption, but for connection. As Rick left the venue that evening, a stranger stopped him outside. "I saw your story online," the man said, extending his hand. "Thank you for sharing it. You've inspired me to look at my own actions differently." Rick shook the man's hand, gratitude swelling in his chest. He knew his journey wasn't over, that it might never truly end. But he also knew he was moving in the right direction. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong commitment to doing better. And for Rick Hawthorne, that was enough. The aftermath of Rick's actions spread like wildfire, both online and in the real world. Within hours, the video of him spraying paint on Corporal Daniel Okoye became one of the most talked about topics globally. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions, some outrage, others mocking, but all united in their condemnation of Rick's behavior. Memes and hashtags like #PaintGate and #RoyalRespect began trending, turning what had started as a personal outburst into a global spectacle. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, dissecting every detail of the incident. Reporters highlighted not only the act itself, but also Rick's earlier comments and demeanor leading up to it. Clips of his Instagram live rant were replayed endlessly, exposing his arrogance and lack of respect for authority. Viewers around the world tuned in, eager to learn more about the man behind the controversy, and unsurprisingly, they weren't impressed. Back in Florida, Rick's life began unraveling at an alarming pace. His face plastered across news channels made it impossible for him to escape scrutiny. Friends and acquaintances who once admired his success now distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with him. Employees at his real estate company whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of how this scandal would affect their jobs. Clients, many of whom valued professionalism and decorum, started canceling contracts and severing ties with his business. Overnight, the empire Rick had spent decades building was teetering on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, British authorities wasted no time in taking action. Rick was arrested shortly after the incident and taken to a local police station, where he spent the night in custody. The charges against him included vandalism, public disorder, and conduct likely to cause harassment or distress. Bail was set at an astronomical amount, leaving his family scrambling to gather the funds. Laura, Rick's wife, appeared visibly shaken as she spoke to reporters outside the station. "We're cooperating fully with the investigation," she said, her voice trembling. "This has been a very difficult situation for all of us." As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside Rick's London hotel, holding signs that read "Respect our guards" and "Tourists should know better." Some even chanted slogans calling for accountability and justice. The British public, known for their pride in traditions and institutions, rallied behind Corporal Okoye, viewing him as a victim of unnecessary cruelty. Flowers and messages of support piled up near Buckingham Palace, honoring the guard's composure during such a humiliating ordeal. Corporate sponsors and partners back in the U.S. began pulling out one by one. Companies that had once proudly advertised their collaborations with Rick's firm issued statements distancing themselves from him. One major client tweeted, "We expect our partners to uphold values of integrity and respect." Clearly, Mr. Hawthorne does not meet those standards. Even local businesses in Florida felt compelled to cut ties, fearing backlash from customers who supported the growing movement against Rick. Adding insult to injury, Rick's social media accounts became a battleground. His Instagram posts, once filled with glamorous photos of luxury vacations and extravagant meals, were now inundated with angry comments and accusations. Followers bombarded him with messages criticizing his behavior and demanding an apology. Some dug deeper into his past, uncovering instances where he had displayed similar entitled attitudes. Old interviews resurfaced, showing Rick boasting about his wealth and influence while dismissing the struggles of others. To the public, he was no longer just a reckless tourist. He was a symbol of unchecked privilege and entitlement. For Rick, the weight of the fallout was crushing. Sitting alone in his jail cell, he struggled to process how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Just 24 hours ago, he had been basking in the glow of his own self-importance, convinced that the world owed him attention and admiration. Now he was vilified, humiliated, and facing consequences far greater than he could have imagined. As dawn broke over London, Rick realized, with growing dread, that this was only the beginning. The road ahead promised to be long, painful, and filled with reckoning for his actions, his attitude, and the choices that had brought him here. Rick's frustration with the royal guards was reaching its peak. The more he stared at the black officer standing tall and composed, the angrier he became. In his mind, the guard wasn't just ignoring him, he was mocking him. Rick's thoughts spiraled into a mix of irritation and prejudice, fueled by years of unchecked arrogance and privilege. To Rick, this guard didn't fit the image he had in his head of what a proper royal guard should look like. As he continued to mutter under his breath, Rick's voice grew louder, laced with thinly veiled insults. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" he said, shaking his head. "They let anyone wear those uniforms these days, huh? Guy probably doesn't even know what he's doing." His words were sharp and cutting, though they didn't seem to faze the guard. Corporal Daniel Okoye stood perfectly still, his expression neutral, his focus unwavering. Laura, Rick's wife, tried once again to intervene. "Rick, please," she pleaded softly, glancing nervously at the growing crowd around them. "Let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Rick was beyond reasoning. His face flushed red, partly from anger and partly from the few glasses of wine he'd had during lunch. He stepped closer to the guard, invading his personal space, his phone still recording as he addressed his followers on Instagram Live. "You guys see this?" he asked, pointing at the guard. "This guy won't even look at me. Just stands there like a statue. What's the point of having people like him out here if they can't do their job?" The comment drew gasps from nearby tourists. A young woman holding her child's hand shot Rick a disapproving glare. An older man shook his head and muttered, "Disgraceful." But Rick didn't notice, or maybe he just didn't care. He was too caught up in his own world, feeding off the adrenaline rush that came with being the center of attention. To make matters worse, Rick began mimicking the guard's posture, standing stiffly with his arms at his sides and puffing out his chest. "Is this what you call guarding?" he sneered, exaggerating his movements for dramatic effect. "Big tough guy, huh? Bet you couldn't handle a real job." The crowd around him grew restless. Some people started filming Rick's antics, capturing every word and gesture. Others whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with disbelief and disgust. One tourist, a British woman in her 50s, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," she said firmly, "you need to stop. These men are serving their country. Show some respect." Rick turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, come on," he snapped. "Don't act like this is some sacred thing. It's just a bunch of guys standing around in fancy costumes. They're not doing anything special." His words hung heavy in the air, drawing even more stares. Corporal Okoye remained silent, his composure unshaken despite the verbal assault. It was clear that Rick's behavior wasn't just rude. It was deeply disrespectful. Yet, the guard's refusal to react only infuriated Rick further. He hated being ignored, especially when he thought he was making valid points. Unbeknownst to Rick, his actions were creating ripples far beyond the palace grounds. Videos of his tirade were already spreading online, shared by outraged witnesses who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Comments poured in from around the world, condemning Rick's behavior and calling him out for his blatant disrespect. Social media users began digging into his background, uncovering details about his wealth, his business, and his past controversies. Within hours, Rick Hawthorne would become a household name, but not for the reasons he might have hoped. Still oblivious to the storm brewing around him, Rick reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled receipt and pretending to write something on it. "Here," he said mockingly, holding it up to the guard. "I'll give you a tip since you're clearly struggling. Maybe next time, try smiling or something." The tension in the air was palpable. Nearby security personnel exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene. Rick's family looked on helplessly, embarrassed, and increasingly alarmed by his escalating behavior. And Corporal Okoye. He stood firm, embodying grace under pressure, silently enduring the humiliation while maintaining the dignity expected of his position. What happened next would change everything. For Rick, for the guard, and for everyone watching. Rick's time in prison was a harsh wake-up call, though not the kind he had ever imagined for himself. The man who once strutted through life with an air of invincibility now found himself stripped of everything: his freedom, his reputation, and even his sense of identity. His days were spent in a small, cold cell far removed from the luxurious penthouses and private jets he had once called home. For the first time in his life, Rick was forced to confront the consequences of his actions without distractions or excuses. At first, Rick struggled to adapt. He was surrounded by people from vastly different walks of life, many of whom had committed far more serious crimes than his own. Some inmates mocked him, calling him "Paint Guy," after seeing news reports about his infamous stunt. Others taunted him for being a wealthy tourist who thought he was above the rules. Rick kept mostly to himself, avoiding eye contact and retreating into silence whenever possible. But isolation only deepened his misery, leaving him alone with his thoughts and guilt. Over time, however, something began to shift. Rick started attending mandatory counseling sessions offered by the prison, where inmates were encouraged to reflect on their mistakes and consider how they could change moving forward. At first he resisted, dismissing the exercises as pointless. But one day, During a group discussion about accountability, a fellow inmate shared his story, a tale of anger, poor choices, and the devastating impact those decisions had on innocent people. As Rick listened, he felt an unexpected pang of recognition. For the first time, he saw parallels between his own behavior and the harm it had caused. The turning point came when Corporal Daniel Okoye's name appeared in a newspaper article circulated among the inmates. The piece highlighted Daniel's resilience and advocacy work since the incident, including his efforts to promote respect and inclusivity within communities. Reading about the guards' determination to rise above the humiliation struck a chord with Rick. Here was a man who had every reason to harbor bitterness, but instead chose to focus on making a positive difference. It made Rick realize just how selfish and destructive his own actions had been. When Rick was finally released from prison, he returned to Florida a shadow of his former self. The once bustling offices of his real estate company were now empty, their doors permanently closed. Friends and acquaintances avoided him, crossing the street to escape awkward encounters. Even his family dynamics had shifted. Laura filed for divorce shortly after his release, citing irreparable damage to their marriage. His children spoke to him rarely, their voices tinged with disappointment and hurt. Determined to rebuild some semblance of a life, Rick moved into a modest apartment and took odd jobs to make ends meet. It wasn't easy. He was constantly recognized, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Strangers would glare at him in grocery stores or mutter under their breath about that paint guy. Each encounter stung, but Rick forced himself to endure them, knowing he deserved the scorn. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Rick stumbled upon a video of Corporal Okoye speaking at a community event. Dressed in civilian clothes, Daniel addressed a crowd with warmth and humility, urging them to embrace empathy and understanding. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do afterward. Do we learn? Do we grow? Or do we let our past define us forever?" Those words lingered in Rick's mind long after the video ended. Inspired and terrified, he decided to reach out to Daniel directly. He wrote a letter, pouring his heart onto the page. In it, he apologized sincerely for his actions, acknowledging the pain and humiliation he had caused. He admitted his biases and expressed his desire to make amends, though he understood forgiveness might never come. Finally, he asked if they could meet in person so he could apologize face to face. To Rick's surprise, Daniel agreed, but with conditions. He insisted that Rick participate in anti-racism workshops and speak publicly about his journey, using his platform to educate others about privilege and accountability. It wouldn't be easy, Daniel warned, but it was a chance to turn regret into action. Though daunting, Rick accepted the challenge. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for redemption, necessarily, but for the possibility of becoming someone better. Someone worthy of a second chance. Rick's anger had reached a boiling point. The guards' unwavering silence and the disapproving stares from the crowd only fueled his frustration. He felt mocked, belittled, and most of all, ignored. To Rick, this wasn't just about a royal guard refusing to engage. It was personal. In his clouded mind, he needed to make a statement, something that would force everyone to pay attention to him. That's when he spotted it, a can of bright red spray paint sitting on a nearby art vendor's stall. Without hesitation, Rick strode over, grabbed the can, and returned to the scene with a smug grin plastered across his face. His family watched in stunned silence as he approached Corporal Okoye, who remained motionless despite the growing tension. Tourists around them began whispering nervously, unsure of what Rick was about to do. Some stepped back, instinctively sensing that things were about to take a dark turn. "This'll get your attention," Rick muttered under his breath, raising the spray can. With a swift, deliberate motion, he pressed the nozzle and sprayed a streak of bright red paint across the guard's immaculate uniform. The vibrant colors splattered against the crisp fabric, marring its pristine appearance. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by murmurs of shock and outrage. Parents covered their children's eyes, while others whipped out their phones to capture the horrifying moment. Rick, however, seemed unfazed. In fact, he looked almost triumphant. Turning back to his phone, which was still live streaming to his Instagram followers, he smirked into the camera. "See, now that's how you get noticed," he declared, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before ignoring someone like me." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some people shouted at Rick, calling him names and demanding he apologize. Others simply stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend how anyone could act so recklessly. Meanwhile, Corporal Okoye stood perfectly still, adhering to protocol not to react under any circumstances. His training kept him rooted in place, even as the paint dripped down his chest and onto the ground below. It was a testament to his discipline, and a stark contrast to Rick's chaotic behavior. As the commotion grew louder, security personnel finally intervened. 2 officers rushed toward Rick, grabbing him firmly by the arms. "Sir, you need to come with us," one of them said sternly, though Rick struggled against their grip. "What's the big deal?" he shot back, his voice rising. "It's just paint. He's fine." But the damage was done. The once peaceful atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace had been shattered, replaced by a palpable sense of anger and disbelief. Witnesses continued filming, capturing every detail of the incident: the red-streaked uniform, the defiant tourist, and the stoic guard standing tall amidst the chaos. Within minutes, videos of the event began flooding social media platforms, sparking outrage across the globe. Back home in Florida, Rick's antics quickly became headline news. Clips of the paint attack circulated widely, accompanied by hashtags like #disrespectfultourist and #ShameOnRickHawthorne. Viewers were quick to criticize not only his actions, but also the entitled attitude that had led him to believe he could behave however he wanted without consequences. Many pointed out the racial undertones of his comments and behavior, accusing him of targeting Corporal Okoye specifically because of his race. Meanwhile, Daniel Okoye became an unexpected symbol of resilience and dignity. Despite the humiliation of having his uniform defaced, he had maintained his composure throughout the ordeal, earning widespread admiration. Social media users praised him for his professionalism, with many calling him a true representative of the values the Royal Guards were meant to uphold. Messages of support poured in from around the world, thanking him for his service and condemning Rick's actions. For Rick, the reality of what he had done began to sink in, but far too late. As the officers escorted him away from the palace gates, he caught glimpses of the crowd's angry faces and heard their shouts of condemnation. For the first time that day, his bravado faltered. He glanced down at his hands, still clutching the now empty spray can, and felt a pang of unease. But there was no turning back. The paint was dry, the videos were viral, and his life, as he knew it, was about to change forever. Rick's journey toward redemption was anything but smooth. The anti-racism workshops Daniel had insisted on were emotionally grueling, forcing Rick to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world around him. At first, he struggled to keep up with the discussions, often feeling defensive when topics turned personal. Other participants, some of whom had experienced racism firsthand, shared raw, painful stories that left Rick visibly shaken. He couldn't help but wonder, had I ever made someone feel this way? The thought weighed heavily on him. During one particularly intense session, a facilitator asked the group to reflect on moments in their lives when they had perpetuated stereotypes or acted out of bias. When it was Rick's turn to speak, he hesitated, his palms sweating as all eyes turned to him. I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice trembling. For years, he had convinced himself that his wealth and success made him immune to criticism, that he was above reproach. But now, sitting in that circle of strangers, he felt exposed and humbled. Slowly, haltingly, Rick began opening up. He recounted the day at Buckingham Palace, describing how his frustration had spiraled into rage and ultimately led to his reckless actions. I didn't think about what I was doing, he confessed. I didn't care who I hurt because, honestly, I didn't see Corporal Okoye as a person. I saw him as an obstacle, something in my way. His words hung heavy in the air, met with nods of understanding from some and stony silence from others. It was a painful admission, but also a necessary one. Outside of the workshops, Rick faced another daunting task, speaking publicly about his mistakes. Daniel arranged for him to address community groups, schools, and even corporate events, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. These appearances were nerve-wracking for Rick, who dreaded facing audiences that likely despised him. But each time he stood before a crowd, he reminded himself why he was there, not for forgiveness, but to take responsibility. One such event took place at a local high school. As Rick walked onto the stage, murmurs rippled through the auditorium. Students whispered to each other, pointing at him and giggling nervously. Rick swallowed hard, gripping the microphone tightly. "Hi," he began, his voice unsteady. "My name is Rick Hawthorne, and I'm here because I made a huge mistake, one that hurt a lot of people." He went on to describe the incident at Buckingham Palace, sparing no detail about his arrogance, his prejudice, and the fallout that followed. "I thought I was untouchable," he said, his voice cracking. "But what I did wasn't just wrong. It was cruel. And it's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." The room fell silent as Rick spoke, his sincerity cutting through the initial skepticism. When he finished, a few students clapped hesitantly, while others simply stared, processing what they'd heard. Afterward, a teenage girl approached him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you really mean it?" she asked. "Are you actually trying to change?" Rick nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yes," he replied firmly. "I can't undo what I did, but I can try to be better. That's all any of us can do." Despite these small victories, Rick's path remained fraught with challenges. Public opinion was slow to shift. Many still viewed him as irredeemable, and social media continued to serve as a platform for ridicule. Trolls mocked his attempts at reform, accusing him of seeking attention rather than genuine growth. Some days, the negativity felt suffocating, and Rick questioned whether his efforts mattered at all. Even Daniel, though supportive, maintained a cautious distance. Their meetings were cordial but brief, focused primarily on planning future initiatives rather than building a personal connection. "You're doing good work," Daniel told him once, his tone measured. "But trust takes time. Forgiveness isn't something you earn overnight." Rick understood. He knew he couldn't expect absolution. Not from Daniel, not from the public, and certainly not from himself. Yet, despite the uphill battle, he pressed on, determined to honor the second chance he'd been given. Every workshop, every speech, every apology brought him one step closer to becoming someone worthy of respect, even if it was respect he might never fully receive. And so, Rick kept moving forward, carrying the weight of his past while striving to create a different future. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The legal battle that followed Rick's arrest was nothing short of a media circus. News outlets from around the world covered every twist and turn, dissecting courtroom proceedings and speculating about the potential outcomes. Back in Florida, Rick's mugshot became a staple on morning talk shows, late-night comedy sketches, and even satirical cartoons. It seemed as though there was no escaping the public eye, or the judgment that came with it. When the trial finally began, Rick found himself facing not just British prosecutors, but also the court of public opinion. The charges against him were serious: vandalism, disorderly conduct, and racially aggravated behavior. Prosecutors argued that his actions weren't simply a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather a calculated display of disrespect fueled by prejudice. They presented evidence gathered from social media, including clips of his Instagram live rant and screenshots of past comments he'd made online that hinted at racist sentiments. Corporal Daniel Okoye took the stand as one of the key witnesses, delivering a testimony that left the courtroom. and viewers worldwide in awe. Speaking calmly and confidently, Daniel recounted the events of that day, describing how he had maintained his composure despite the humiliation of having his uniform defaced. He explained the rigorous training and discipline required to serve as a royal guard, emphasizing the importance of remaining stoic under pressure. "I represent my country, my regiment, and my family," he said, his voice steady. "No act of disrespect will ever change that." Daniel's words resonated deeply with those listening. Many in the courtroom wiped away tears as he spoke, moved by his grace and resilience. Outside, supporters cheered, holding signs that read, "We stand with Corporal Okoye," and "Respect is earned, not given." Social media exploded with praise for the guard, with hashtags like #ThankYouDaniel trending globally. For many, Daniel wasn't just a victim. He was a hero, a symbol of dignity and strength in the face of adversity. Rick's defense team tried their best to paint his actions as a drunken mistake, arguing that he hadn't intended to cause harm or offense. They called witnesses who testified about Rick's otherwise generous nature, pointing to his charitable donations and community involvement back home. But these efforts fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence showing his pattern of entitled behavior. Clips of his mocking tone and racially charged remarks during the incident were replayed repeatedly, leaving little room for doubt about his true intentions. As the trial progressed, Rick's arrogance began to crumble. Sitting in the defendant's chair, he looked smaller somehow, less imposing, more vulnerable. Gone was the brash, self-assured man who had strutted through Buckingham Palace gates just weeks earlier. In his place was someone visibly shaken, struggling to reconcile the consequences of his actions with the life he had taken for granted. His family attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the front row, their expressions a mix of shame and sorrow. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. The judge delivered a stern rebuke, calling Rick's behavior an affront to decency and respect. He sentenced him to 2 years in prison, imposed hefty fines, and banned him from entering the United Kingdom for life. As the gavel struck, Rick slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it live to millions of viewers who had been following the case closely. Back in the U.S., the fallout continued. Rick's real estate company, once a powerhouse in Florida's competitive market, filed for bankruptcy after losing nearly all its clients. Properties that bore his name were rebranded in an effort to distance themselves from the scandal. Former colleagues spoke out, revealing stories of Rick's abrasive leadership style and dismissive attitude toward employees. Even his closest friends turned their backs, unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation had become synonymous with disgrace. For Laura and their children, the impact was equally devastating. Once accustomed to luxury vacations and high-profile events, they now faced financial uncertainty and relentless public scrutiny. Their kids withdrew from school activities, too embarrassed to face classmates who mocked them for their father's actions. Laura, meanwhile, spent her days fielding calls from reporters and lawyers, trying to salvage what little remained of their shattered lives. Amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: Rick Hawthorne's life would never be the same. What had started as a petty act of rebellion had spiraled into a full-blown catastrophe, costing him not only his freedom but also his livelihood, relationships, and dignity. And while some might have felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction watching him fall from grace, others couldn't help but wonder if redemption